When the American financial system began to crumble, it wasn't the government that intervened first. It wasn't Congress. It wasn't the president. He was a man. In closed rooms, away from the cameras, a small group of bankers awaited instructions while banks collapsed, lines formed, and fear spread through the streets. And, at the center of that room, was J.P. Morgan, unelected, unappointed, but treated as the country's last line of defense. The most disturbing thing is not that he saved the system. That's because he's oil saved him. Because that moment revealed something that few realized at the time and that still haunts us today: the market didn't fall into Morgan's hands by accident. It fell because it was built to depend on someone like him. And the most impressive thing? After all that, Morgan emerged bigger, stronger, and his bank has never left the top spot. This is not just the story of a crisis, it's the story of how modern financial power learned to survive any collapse. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, subscribe now, because today's story explains why, at certain times, real power lies not in governments, but in the right coffers. What you're about to see here isn't conspiracy theory. It's a documented, studied, and, interestingly, little discussed event outside of financial circles. At the beginning of the 20th century, the United States was growing too fast for its banking system to keep up. Fragile banks, disorganized credit, aggressive speculation, and zero national coordination created an unstable environment. A single scare, a rumor, a bank run, or an isolated bankruptcy was all it took for everything to collapse. And that's exactly what began to happen in 1907, when the American financial system panicked. While the public saw only alarming headlines and lines at bank doors, something much more serious was happening behind the scenes. The American government had no tools to contain the crisis. There was no Federal Reserve. There was no central bank. There was no plan. For the first time, it became clear that the state had no real control over its own financial system. And it was in this power vacuum that a name began to circulate quietly, not as an official savior, but as last hope, a man whose influence was so great that he could move banks, businessmen, and politicians without holding any public office. A private banker who, that night, would do something that would forever change the relationship between money and power in the United States. The question that no one dared ask aloud was simple: who really calls the shots when the system collapses? If you're not already subscribed to the channel, subscribe now, because today's story explains why, at certain times, real power doesn't lie with governments, but with the right coffers. What you're about to see isn't conspiracy theory. It's a documented, studied, and, interestingly, little discussed episode outside of financial circles. At the beginning of the 20th century, the United States was growing too fast for its banking system to keep up. Fragile banks, disorganized credit, aggressive speculation, and zero national coordination created an unstable environment. A single scare, a rumor, a bank run, or an isolated bankruptcy was all it took for everything to collapse. And that's exactly what began to happen in 1907, when the American financial system panicked. While the public saw only alarming headlines and lines at bank doors, something far more serious was happening behind the scenes. The American government lacked the tools to contain the crisis. There was no Federal Reserve. There was no central bank. There was no plan. For the first time, it became clear that the state had no real control over its own financial system. And it was in this power vacuum that a name began to circulate silently, not as an official savior, but as a last hope. A man whose influence was so great that he could move banks, businessmen, and politicians without holding any public office. A private banker who, that night, would do something that would forever change the relationship between money and power in the United States. The question that no one dared ask aloud was simple: who really calls the shots when the system collapses? John Pierpont Morgan was not born powerful, but he was born powerful. Prepared for power. Your father, Junius Spencer Morgan. Morgan was already a respected figure in the international financial world, operating between London and New York at a time when European capital still dictated the pace of the American economy. While many bankers in the United States were still local and improvised, the Morgan family thought in global terms. From an early age, J.P. Morgan was trained to operate in this closed and selective world. He studied in Europe, learned languages, absorbed British financial culture, and developed something rare for the time: international credibility that made all the difference. When a Morgan signed a deal, European banks trusted him. When he promised liquidity, investors believed him. He wasn't just a banker, he was a link between two financial continents. This background profoundly shaped his market vision. Morgan believed in order, discipline, and control. He despised disorganized speculation and saw the American financial system as too chaotic to survive without strong leadership. For him, crises were not accidents, but natural consequences of a system without central command. And if the government didn't assume that role, someone else would have to. When the Panic of 1907 began to spread, J.P. Morgan was no longer just a wealthy banker. He was the point of convergence of financial confidence, banks called him. Businessmen asked for his guidance. Even politicians watched from a distance, not because he held public office, but because, at that moment, no one else seemed capable of keeping the system afloat. On the most critical night of the Panic of 1907, while banks closed their doors and confidence evaporated, J.P. Morgan did something no politician had managed to do, took control in his private library on Madison Avenue. He gathered the most powerful men in American finance, bank presidents, industrial leaders, and trust executives. It wasn't an invitation. It was an urgent summons. Those who weren't present would be left out of the decisions that would determine who survived the crisis. The doors were literally shut. Morgan analyzed accounting books by lamplight, questioned bankers about their reserves, and coldly separated, with surgical precision, viable institutions from those that should fail. For some, he arranged immediate bailouts. For others, he made it clear that there would be no salvation. The criterion was not sympathy, nor politics, but systemic stability. For the first time, a private man was deciding, in real time, which parts of the American financial system would continue to exist. Meanwhile, the money began to move. Morgan coordinated massive capital transfers between banks, convinced reluctant institutions to lend to each other, and ensured sufficient liquidity to halt the bank run. There were no public speeches or official announcements. The markets simply stopped falling. The panic subsided. And, without realizing it, the country was going through the worst moment of the crisis under the leadership of someone who had no mandate, position, or popular vote. The following morning, the newspapers called it a miracle. But those inside the room knew the truth. The system wasn't saved by the government, it was saved by private coordination concentrated in a single figure. The question that began circulating behind the scenes was unsettling. If a banker could have done this all by himself, who really controls the American economy? The impact of that night didn't end when the panic subsided. On the contrary, it left an uncomfortable question echoing in Washington and on Wall Street: what if J.P. Morgan hadn't acted? The answer was too obvious to ignore. The American financial system had survived by luck, not by structure. And depending on the goodwill or ability of a single private banker was too great a risk for a country that already saw itself as a world power. The 1907 crisis exposed something that had been masked for decades. The United States had strong banks, abundant capital, and rapid growth, but no central coordination mechanism. Each crisis was resolved haphazardly, and each solution created new risks. The miracle orchestrated by Morgan worked, but it also revealed how vulnerable the system truly was. The country could not continue to rely on occasional saviors. It was in this context that politicians, economists, and bankers began to discuss something previously unthinkable for many Americans: the creation of a central bank. An institution capable of providing liquidity in times of crisis, regulating credit, and preventing the collapse of one institution from contaminating the entire system. The irony was clear: the public solution emerged precisely after a private solution had worked too well. And while this debate gained momentum, a silent truth was solidifying: J.P. Morgan had proven that coordination is power. He not only saved the system, he showed how to control it. And this demonstration would leave deep marks on how money, government, and banks would relate to each other from then on. The Panic of 1907 didn't transform J.P. Morgan into a hidden ruler of the United States. That would be an exaggeration. But it left something equally important: concrete evidence that the American financial system was structurally weak. The crisis has shown, without a doubt, that the country's economy depended too much on makeshift solutions and the goodwill of private bankers during critical moments. No sector has given J.P. Morgan more power than railroads. At the end of the 19th century, railroads were what data is today: critical infrastructure. They connected markets, controlled prices, and determined who prospered and who failed. And almost all of them were indebted, poorly managed, and on the verge of collapse. Morgan entered this sector not as a conqueror, but as a reorganizer. He led the restructuring of giants such as Northern Pacific, Erie Railroad and Reading Railroad, imposing agreements between competitors to avoid destructive price wars. These agreements were not illegal at the time, they were seen as necessary for the survival of the system. By organizing private conferences between railroad presidents, Morgan began to coordinate tariffs, investments, and expansion. This was something no public agency was doing. It wasn't state control, nor a secret conspiracy, it was a practical response to the economic chaos of a rapidly industrializing country. Over time, this performance turned Morgan into a sort of break-even point. He wasn't officially in charge, but nothing significant happened in the railway sector without his office being consulted. His power stemmed from trust and the lack of viable alternatives. After the railroads, Morgan took the same model to heavy industry. The most famous of these operations was the creation of U.S. Steel in 1901. The world's first company was valued at over $1 billion. Morgan did not invent the steel industry, he organized a chaotic sector, merging competitors to eliminate instability. These large conglomerates, called trusts, generate controversy. Critics said they concentrated too much power. Defenders argued that they brought efficiency and predictability. Morgan, true to his style, did not enter the moral debate. He stabilized. Their focus was not on domination, but on systemic survival. It's important to make this clear. J.P. Morgan did not operate outside the law. Many of the practices that would sound alarming today are simply, they were not regulated at the beginning of the 20th century. The American financial system was still young, fragmented, and lacked clear supervisory mechanisms. Morgan operated within a veritable, institutional vacuum in a time when the state did not yet have the tools to coordinate or contain an economy that was growing too fast. Even so, his power began to generate discomfort. In 1912, the United States Congress launched a formal investigation known as Worship Committee. The investigation was created to determine if a small group of bankers was concentrating excessive influence over the market. Morgan was called to testify, not because he had broken a specific law, but because his name repeatedly appeared in the investigation. All the gears of the system: credit, infrastructure, industry, and transportation. The accusations revolved around the concept of interlocking directorates, the practice of the same people holding decision-making positions in banks, railroads, steel mills, and supplier companies. Morgan and his allies financed the railroads, participated in their boards, influenced companies that supplied raw materials, and controlled the credit that kept everything running. For many parliamentarians, this was not just efficiency, it was an invisible structural monopoly capable of steering the economy's destiny without ever appearing at the ballot box. In the end, Morgan was not convicted legally, he was protected by the absence of clear rules. But the impact of the investigation was profound. The testimony exposed the state's lag in the face of private financial power and accelerated historical changes, the strengthening of antitrust laws, the creation of new banking regulations, and, shortly thereafter, the birth of Federal Reserve. Morgan emerged unscathed, but the system would never be the same again. When the Panic of 1907 hit, therefore, J.P. Morgan didn't emerge from nowhere. He was already the man who had organized railroads, steel, banks, and credit. The crisis merely shone a spotlight on something that had already existed for decades. The Panic of 1907 left a message impossible to ignore. The United States had a modern, complex, and interconnected economy, but still operated with a makeshift financial system. Banks were collapsing in a chain reaction, credit was evaporating, and there was no central authority capable of acting quickly. The fact that J.P. Morgan coordinated the bailout was seen not only as heroism, but as a clear sign of institutional fragility. Politicians, economists, and bankers began to ask themselves the same question, albeit silently: what if Morgan wasn't there? The reliance on a single private financier to save the system revealed an enormous risk. Money history shows that crises rarely create problems, they merely expose those that already exist. And the problem there was evident: the country lacked an official mechanism to deal with financial collapses. In the following years, the debate gained momentum. Committees were formed, studies conducted, and trips to Europe undertaken to understand how other countries dealt with banking crises. The American model, decentralized and fragmented, seemed outdated. The idea of a central bank, previously viewed with suspicion, began to sound less like a threat and more like a necessity. It is in this climate of silent tension, forced learning, and fear of repetition that the American financial system begins to change definitively. Not out of idealism, nor altruism, but for survival. And it is precisely here that history takes its next step, when the power that emerged from the chaos ends up shaping the rules of the future. This story didn't end with the panic of 1907. In fact, it merely changed form. The institution shaped by J.P. Morgan weathered wars, collapses, reforms, and crises, and even today remains one of the most powerful financial institutions in the United States. The name changed, the structures modernized, but the influence remained. The J.P. Morgan chase that dominates current headlines carries in its DNA the decisions made at that critical moment in the history of money. After Morgan's death, the power did not evaporate. His son, J.P. Morgan Jr. he assumed leadership and kept the bank at the center of global financial decisions for decades. Over time, the helm ceased to be a family affair, but came to be occupied by successors trained within the very machinery that Morgan had built. This was no accident. It was design. The bank survived because it learned to institutionalize itself by transforming personal influence into permanent power. And perhaps that's the most unsettling point of this whole story. Crises pass, men die, headlines change, but well-constructed power structures remain. Understanding J.P. Morgan is not just understanding a man, it's understanding how the modern financial system learned to concentrate, protect, and perpetuate power, and that's precisely why this story still resonates today, whenever the market trembles and someone silently asks, who really holds the system together when everything threatens to collapse?